All right, hello everyone, welcome. This is our Tag Inspector webinar on crumbling cookies, how changing browser cookie policies affect your digital marketing. Looks like a few people are still trickling in, but that's perfectly fine. We'll go ahead and get started. To kind of kick it off here, just a little general housekeeping. So a little bit about Tag Inspector and then myself. So I'm Lucas, that's me. I will be presenting here today, going through the content, a little bit of background. I am the product manager for our software product Tag Inspector, which is a tag auditing and monitoring platform brought to you or produced by it's a product of InfoTrust. On the InfoTrust side of the house, we do tag management consulting work, analytics consulting work, and work really everything in the area of digital marketing, data collection, advertising targeting, and the like. We do a number of these educational webinars, both in-person webinars around topics such as, in-person events around topics such as data governance, analytics, training, and then also these educational webinar series such as today, where we'll be going through the topic of cookies. Quick disclaimer, I will be touching on a few pieces of the legislation and the regulations that speak to the use and requirements for consent around cookies. Obviously, this is not legal counsel. We'll be mentioning some of those things, but for any ultimate decisions on any legal matters, definitely consult your legal representation to make sure that the relevant guidelines, regulations, laws in the different countries and locations and industries that you're working in are being followed. Cool. So with that out of the way, just a quick overview of what we'll be going through today. So the agenda. First, we'll be starting out, we'll just be doing a general review of cookies. So an overview of what cookies are, what tags are, how they work. From there, we will talk briefly about the regulatory considerations. I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page when we're speaking about cookies and the laws and regulations that everyone needs to follow and keep in mind. They're also really important when we think about why these different browser changes are being made and the different policies and just restrictions that are being put in place there. It's all related to the underlying push for more user privacy. So the laws, regulations are definitely tied in and related to the browser limits that we will be speaking to. Following that, we'll go through the actual browser policies and restrictions. So let you know kind of what this current status is with reference to cookies and any storage on a browser device. For the main ones that are out there. So we'll speak specifically about Safari, Firefox, and then Chrome. Once we go through and really dig into exactly what those limits and those restrictions are, we'll then go through an overview of what this means for you. So what are the implications are for your business, things that you really should keep in mind, and then we'll wrap it up with some best practices and recommendations. So what are the things that you should be thinking about, both from a strategic as well as a tactical perspective, due to these various different limitations and changes that are being introduced to the handling and the accessibility of cookies within your users' browsers. Finally, we'll wrap it up with just a quick summary and Q&A. As always, to go ahead and answer the most popular question always asked in webinars. Yes, so we'll be following up after this with the ability to download the slides as well as download a recording of the webinar. So please, pay attention and can kind of really dig into any of those pieces afterwards because we'll be sending out that content. And please drop any questions into the questions pane there in the GoToWebinar control panel that you should have. I try to answer those just as we go through, anything that's really relevant to the sections as we're going through them. I want this to be as much of a conversation, as helpful as possible. But anything kind of outstanding, or if I don't get to anything, we will try to address it. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end to go through Q&A. Cool. So with that, let's dig right in. So to start off with just a general overview of cookies. So what are cookies? How do they work? What exactly are we talking about here? So cookies are just little text files that get placed on a user's browser. The purpose of cookies is to be able to save information to be accessed later. Now, oftentimes when we're talking about well, cookies and data collection, privacy, regulations, consent, those types of topics, people get really confused, I think, or they at least confuse the language and talk about cookies as if they're talking about the JavaScript or the tags that are on the page that are responsible for collecting the information. A cookie you can think of as just, it's like a name tag that you're placing on someone, in this case on a user's browser, that is saving information, again, to be referenced later. So think about how you write maybe a name. If you're at a conference, you're writing like a name and a job title on a name card, placing that on an individual. So as they go around the conference, meeting new people, interacting with different sponsors or vendors, then that information is accessible to those people that they're having a conversation with. That's how cookies work, except they're being placed on the user's browser, saving that information, again, to be accessed or able to be accessed by different websites or different platforms that users interacting with. Now, it's critical we do not confuse cookies with tags. So tags, and that's what I have highlighted here on this page, are JavaScript codes that are embedded on websites that are the mechanism via which functionality of various different analytics, marketing, advertising platforms work or introduced on that web page. It's also the mechanism via which data is collected and oftentimes how cookies are being set. So tags are the actual JavaScript that's running, collecting data, sending that back to analytics, advertising tools, as well as collecting and reading and then sending off the data that's being stored in cookies. Now, how this works, user comes to a web page, the browser is reading the scripts that are on that web page. A tag is embedded in those scripts or in that HTML on the page. The tag executes, it's sending a request off to its servers. So in this case, a Google Tag Manager tag is sending off a request to Google's servers, and it's returning a bunch more code that is then running, grabbing some different information from the browser, setting different cookies, maybe like a user ID or an anonymous ID for that particular user, bundling that information together, and then sending that back to, in this case, Google's servers. That's how it's working, the tags that are associated with any marketing advertising platforms that are loading on your website. It's just that it's sending off different information, pulling back different scripts, running those and setting different cookies. So the tags are the mechanism that are responsible for the placement, as well as the accessing and reading of cookies, as well as the aggregation and then the sending or collecting of information for things like your analytics, advertising, marketing platforms that are running on your web pages. Again, critical here that we differentiate between these different things, because as we talk about what the laws and what those restrictions are, they're different for cookie laws such as e-privacy versus data collection and data protection regulations such as GDPR or CCPA. They're different there, and then also these browser changes, they're impacting cookies. They're meant to directly address cookies, whereas these tags are still able to run. So there is a difference between just the ability to collect information as well as the ability to place and store information for later reference on a user's browser. So quick definition review, just to kind of wrap up this overview. Tags are the JavaScript code on a website. It's a mechanism via which data is collected, platform functionality runs, and the cookies are being set. Cookies are the small text files that are placed on a user's browser used to save information for later reference. So again, that name tag with that context that can be placed on the user's browser. A couple other just topics, I guess, to mention here. We'll speak a little bit about these a little bit later. One, HTML web storage. These things are other storage mechanisms on a user's browser, similar to cookies, but um, different, I guess, and more recently being leveraged. So things like local storage and session storage are the two different kinds of web storage that you might hear. Some people look at these as alternatives to cookies, and it's true, they are a different place where you can set information. You can actually store a little bit more information within these. And people sometimes, as these restrictions come out limiting the use of cookies and the accessibility of cookies, they will propose using these other mechanisms of storage as kind of a workaround in many different cases. I say that because as these browser limits and regulation or limitations that we will be speaking to evolve, they're evolving to go beyond just cookies and also placing restrictions on web storage as well for what third parties can save and access from those different locations. The last topic here, just to mention, browser fingerprinting. This is a means of tying together a lot of different just seemingly disparate data points from a user's browser, combining all of that together to create a unique fingerprint or profile of a particular user. So again, this is another way that some platforms will propose working around the use of cookies. The most common use of cookies, or the most common thing that's going to be placed or saved in a cookie is going to be some sort of a user ID or an anonymous ID for a user, just so that you can track that specific user, that specific browser across websites, across sessions on the same website. And as these limitations within the browser make that much more difficult to do and wipe that clean, browser fingerprinting is a means by which different people will propose still being able to maintain that identification of a user across websites. Now we'll talk about this. It really goes against the spirit of these different limitations and also the spirit of the regulations that we'll talk about for protecting users' privacy across the web. But I wanted to bring it up here just so everyone is aware of this particular practice, what it means when we speak on it a little bit later as well. So that's an overview. What cookies are, how they work, some of the other things that are tangentially related to cookies. That's going to help us out significantly as we go through some of these topics. Now, I want to quickly speak to regulatory considerations because regardless of what browsers your users are using, if you're dealing with users in Europe specifically, there are regulatory considerations and requirements legally that you need to be keeping in mind for how you're treating users with respect to cookies. So when you're able to access or place cookies, and this again is regardless of what browser the user is using. So it doesn't matter what the restrictions are being faced or the policy is for Safari or for Chrome, a regulatory consideration is going to be universal or blanket across all of these. So when we're talking about this, and we're talking about regulations specific to cookies and specific to the storage of information in a user's browser, we're specifically speaking about the EU and the e-privacy directives. So e-privacy directive was a EU-wide directive, which you'll often hear referred to as cookie laws. So basically what it was doing, or what it did, was stated that each of the individual member states needed to protect users' privacy by limiting the access or giving users greater rights with respect to consenting to the use or the placement of cookies and storage of information to be able to track them across the web. Now, what's unique about this is that each of these individual cookie laws are defined and enforced by the individual member states. So what the requirements are, for example, in the UK versus Spain versus France are different. That's the status today. Now, they're working on a more unified or codified e-privacy regulation, which is still in the works, has been for several years now. We'll see once that comes out, and it'll be more uniform across the entire EU. But as of today, these cookie laws are unique to the individual countries. Now, these are a few just requirement examples, and they all speak to consent. So the main purpose of these laws and these regulations is to confer on users more control over what information is saved and stored about them in cookies or storage on their browsers. So the requirements are around transparency as well as around consent. Now, the consent requirements for the use and the accessing of cookies vary, again, by country. So, for example, within the UK, recent clarification from the ICO ties the consent requirements for the placement and the accessing of cookies to the consent requirements as defined within GDPR, which means that consent must be unambiguous, a positive action. It needs to be explicit consent, that a user is explicitly clicking on something that is saying, I accept to the use of these cookies, prior to you being able to place those and prior to you being able to access those on a user's browser. Contrast this with the requirement in Spain, for example, where the consent to cookies can be implied so long as the user has been informed about the use of the cookies and has the ability to opt out. Now, implied consent means that we're implying that the user is saying yes to the use of these, the placement and the accessing of these cookies, unless they are opting out. So in the UK, when a user comes to the website, I cannot place a cookie or access a cookie on that user's browser until they have explicitly said this is okay. Whereas in Spain, I can do so until they say this is not okay. So these are the cookie laws. Again, look up and be sure to reference the individual governing body within any of the countries in which you're doing business. But these are the legal requirements around transparency, disclosure, and consent with respect to the use of cookies. And again, the purpose of this is in order to be able to give users more control over the information that's available about them and how organizations are able to save that and store that to create a profile of them across several different websites and different data sources. Now, I know I mentioned GDPR on that last slide. It's really important that we at least make a mention of cookies with respect to these data collection and data processing regulations, data privacy regulations. So GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, are two big pieces of legislation that many organizations are having to do a lot of work around. And many of the conversations that I'm having with organizations about data governance and tag compliance, tag governance in general, there is confusion, as mentioned before, between cookies and tags. So GDPR, it's important to note, speaks to the processing of personal data, whereas CCPA speaks to the use and sale of personal information. The placement of a cookie on a user's device, again, that is a mechanism through which we are storing or saving information for later reference. Just because a cookie is placed on a user's device does not mean that we are collecting that information. 95% of the time, yes, we will be, but there are different things. The collection and the processing of data versus the placement and the accessing of cookies on a user's device. So the requirements here with respect to cookies versus with respect to data being collected are a little bit different. Now, where this all ties together and why I started out with the description there of how cookies work and how tags work is that because tags, the JavaScript code that is embedded on a website, oftentimes is the mechanism by which both data is being collected by a given platform, as well as the mechanism through which cookies are being set for that third-party platform advertising marketing technology. When we're talking about consent, the way in which we limit or restrict the placement of a cookie until consent has been given is by not executing or running a particular tag until that consent has been given. So in this way, these cookie laws, these regulations impact the amount of data that we're able to collect. Because even if we are only collecting aggregate statistical information and we have a legal basis of processing, say we're using legitimate consent because the risk to the users is very, very low of any personal data being able to affect them. So we have a legal basis for collecting information under GDPR, but we don't have a mechanism via which to separate the placement of the cookie from the collection of the data. We're not executing that tag until a user has given consent. So there's implications here for the regulations speaking to cookies, and then kind of related effects for the data that's been collected. So wanted to just quickly touch on that. There's additional content on the Tag Inspector website, several different webinars, as well as written content, and a few ebooks where we really dig into these different regulatory considerations around just data governance in general. If you're interested in those topics, check those out. But once you kind of move on to speaking about the browser implications and policies around cookies specifically, and those different restrictions. So we will do just that. So the different browser policies and restrictions, they're different based upon the individual browser and the organization. So they're different for Safari, they're different for Mozilla, they're different from Chrome, or for Chrome, which are the three major ones that are making up over 90% of the market. And so those are the three that we're going to cover here today. So the first one, and the one that most people have probably heard of and are aware of, is Apple with their ITP, so Intelligent Tracking Prevention Initiative. I have the three most recent examples up here because they build upon one another, and I think it's really it really well illustrates how these different restrictions are evolving, which speaks to some of the practical implications that we'll be speaking about here towards the end. So ITP 2.1, what it did was remove partition cookies. If a domain was classified as having cross-site tracking capabilities, it needs to access its cookies in a third-party context. It must use Storage Access API, so different mechanism for accessing third-party cookies. It placed new restrictions were placed on first-party cookies set via client-side JavaScript, and then it set by default a 7-day expiry even on first-party cookies. So all JavaScript cookies have that 7-day expiry at most. And then by removing the partition cookies altogether, it basically restricted and made third-party cookies, or cookies that can be accessed in that third-party context, moot. So you can't really access those on Safari after this 2.1 update. 2.2 then was rolled out. So as of ITP 2.2, persistent cookies set through document.cookie, which is the method through which, when you're running JavaScript, so those tags, if a tag is setting a cookie via third-party JavaScript on your website, which is going to be how most cookies are being set on your sites for marketing, advertising platforms, or technologies that are embedded. Those are capped to 24 hours of storage when both of the conditions are met. One is that a domain classified with cross-site tracking capabilities is responsible for navigating the user to the current web page, and then the final URL has some sort of tracking parameters, so like query string parameters or a fragment identifier. In practice, what this means is that if a user comes from a domain that is known to have cross-site tracking capabilities, so a domain from most advertisers or social media platforms. So if a user is coming to your website from Facebook, the final URL, so your landing page URL, which would likely be the case, has some sort of a query string parameter. So like a CID, if you're using Adobe Analytics, or UTM parameters if you're using GA, or gclid values if you're using like a double-click link. If it has those for purposes of attribution tracking just within your analytics, and it's coming from that classified domain, any cookie, including first-party cookies, so any cookie that's set via JavaScript on your web page is going to be capped with a 24-hour expiry. So user comes via a campaign that you're running on Facebook, lands on your website, even your first-party analytics tracking, so your GA cookies that are being set, have a 24-hour expiry. You can still, see that session, tie together actions within that session. That's all fine. But if that user, say, comes, views a product, views a product on Facebook, clicks through to your website, views that product page, and then leaves, comes back 2 days later, goes to that same product, adds it to the cart, goes through, purchases that product. When the user comes back 2 days later, because that expiry on that cookie was only 24 hours, that's going to show up as a brand new user. You're not going to be able to tie those two different sessions together. So you're going to have two new users, even though it's the same user, when traditionally that would be two sessions for that same user. So there's major implications here for analytics tracking, attribution purposes, all of that. Now, even if in that previous scenario, even if one of those two conditions down there are not met, because of the updates in ITP 2.1, the most, even a first-party cookie that's set via JavaScript is going to persist for is going to be 7 days, because it caps that expiry, that 7-day expiry. So again, big implications here for visit sessions, new users versus returning users, and then the ability to tie together things for purposes of attribution, especially multi-touch. So those were the first two, and those were the big things that really initially set waves kind of through the advertising marketing technology space. Then there was the 2.3 update, which doesn't have too many further crazy implications, I guess. But again, it illustrates the evolution of these different protections or policies that are being put in place by various different browsers. So 2.3 ITP caps the lifetime of all script writable website data after a navigation with link decoration from a classified domain. What this means, basically, those different restrictions that were put in place in 2.2 related to any first-party cookie or any cookie that's set via JavaScript, this now extends also to local storage and session storage. So as mentioned in the first section, cookies are one way in which you can store information on a user's browser for later reference. You can also do so via those storage abilities within the browser as well. So after 2.2 was released, what did a lot of people begin doing? Just setting IDs to be able to tie sessions together and then referencing those and sending those up within their different platforms, setting those in local storage in order to be able to save that information, reference that information later. What the 2.3 update does is extends those limitations even to anything that's written to those different storage locations within the browser, and it expands it beyond cookies. Also, document.refer downgraded to ETLD +1. Basically, what was happening was another workaround that different platforms were starting to do was, instead of decorating the landing page URL with their query string parameters or the tracking parameters, they would put that on the refer page, on the page prior to the user navigating to your particular website, for example. And then what their JavaScript was doing was referencing the refer URL as opposed to the current page URL, and then parsing the parameters from that in order to be able to get that attribution information in order to be able to, again, tie together that user or pass an ID from one site to another site. This update also put restrictions in place that makes that not possible either, by just changing the level at which document.refer is within the page. So technical ways, I guess, of basically addressing workarounds that were being introduced. So it's important, again, because I've said it before, but it illustrates how these are evolving. So it's not just, hey, this is a technical limitation, let me figure out a way of working around it. It is these are technical protections being put in place because our users care about privacy and being tracked across different sites and being tracked in a persistent manner, unless they are actively giving you, consent or through various different mechanisms to be able to do this. If you don't have a relationship with that user, we do not want to make it possible as the browser technology to be able to track this individual and develop any kind of a profile, tie together habits or actions across different sessions or across different websites. So it really drives home the point that these protections are in place. There's a spirit to them and not just the written words, and that they're going to continue to evolve in order to protect and ultimately see through that goal of user privacy. Now, in addition to Safaris, so those are Safari's the ITP updates, and they're specific to users that are using Safari browsers. The next browser here is Mozilla or Firefox, and what they have is enhanced tracking prevention. Now, just to really summarize the various different protections that they have in place, basically what enhanced tracking prevention with Mozilla does is by default, it will block known third-party tracking cookies according to they call it the disconnect list. It's linked to within their documentation. You can actually see the full list of the domains. So what it does is if a cookie is being set by or accessed by any of the domains that are within that list or being set on any of the domains that are in that list, it'll automatically be stripped and it'll block access from third-party tracking content. So this list, though, what's really important about it, basically just makes third-party cookies not usable. And this includes cookies that are set by many enterprise analytics and ad tech platforms. So that list contains like any known domain. So any Google Analytics, for example, it's going to block those domains that are associated with Adobe Analytics. Most of your advertising technologies, advertising exchanges, DSPs, DMPs, the whole nine are on that list. Now you can reference that list, see if your particular vendor, or if you have a custom solution is listed on there to see if it would be impacted by Safari's ETP, but it likely would be. And what that is just, again, any cookie that's set on any of those domains, it's going to block access to them. Now, finally, the most recent browser policy update and restrictions that are going in place are the Chrome 80 update. So this went out last month. It finally went out the week of February 17th. It was originally announced for the 4th, but was pushed back a little bit. And what happened here was, from a technical perspective, the update changed the default cookie behavior. So Chrome, a while ago, had introduced the concept of same site attribute. Now, let me actually take a step back. So before, when we talked about cookies, how they work, what they are, when a cookie gets placed, there is a cookie name, there is a value. So a name is kind of, you can think of as a parameter, key value pair, it's the key. The value is the cookie value. So whatever the value is, so like a user ID, for example. And then there's additional attributes that are also associated with that cookie. one of which is an attribute that is same site. So introduced a while ago was the same site attribute. Many people were not using it or leveraging it. The default behavior previously was for if same site was not defined, then it would be treated as if same site equals none. Now, there's three different values basically that this attribute can be denoted as. The first one is none. If same site equals none, that means that a cookie can be accessed in like your traditional third-party cookie context. So cookies can be set on any domain and then accessed from any domain. Anything's possible, basically. When same site equals lacks, sorry. Well, the second one is if same site equals strict. If same site equals strict, only cookies that are set on the domain, on the first party domain, so the domain that's in the browser bar, can be accessed. So if I'm on website.com, I can only access cookies that are also set on website.com. That's strict. So only cookies that match the domain of the page in which that you're on are able to be accessed. The third attribute is lax. What lax is, it's that strict behavior plus any cookies that are on a domain that is being navigated to are also accessible. So what this means, if I'm on a.com and I'm clicking a link and I'm navigating to b.com, any cookies that are on either a.com or b.com would be accessible. Any cookies that are placed on those domains are accessible. That's the lax behavior. So it's not true open third-party cookies, but it just allows a little bit more flexibility with first-party cookies and be able to store information just within the context of navigation. So with the Chrome 80 update, that same site equals lax by default if it's not defined. If you are wanting to use a cookie in the true third-party context, so if you want it to be the cookie to be placed on the domain of c.com and be able to access it from a.com, true third-party, different context, then that same site attribute must be set to none, and then also contain a secure attribute or secure denotation basically within that. So the change here isn't crazy. It's not a huge leap. It's not restricting anything with the length that cookies, the expiry or duration of cookies, such as ITP did. It's not really even touching first-party cookies or cookies set in the first-party context. So you're not having really implications with advertising or first-party data. The change here is just if you are leveraging third-party cookies, then some updates need to be made within the scripts that are responsible for setting those. So same site needs to be equal to none and also have that secure attribute for any third-party cookie in order for it to be accessible and still usable in the way in which it traditionally has been. So the Chrome 80 update, what it does is, or who it mostly impacts, is any vendor that is leveraging third-party cookies. It's really not typically going to be on you, the organization, the end user, or the end website. No update by and large is going to be required there. So that's the Chrome 80 update, and that's basically the first restriction that they've placed with respect to cookies. Now, around the same time of that update going live, there was also a major announcement. And this is where you were probably seeing a lot of the content pieces and think pieces and takes talking about the death of the cookie and how cookies are going away. And we're in this, the future is this fully cookieless world. So this announcement was a blog post by Chrome's Director of Engineering. And what was announced was an aim to phase out the use of third-party cookies within 2 years, with the goal being to create a new set of privacy-focused open web standards. So third-party cookies, what they allow you to do is store that information for a user on that user's browser, and then for that to be accessible across different web pages. So we can use the example a.com. I place a cookie when that user's on a.com. User then goes to b.com. I can still access that cookie. So I can still, most of the time, like a user ID is going to be something that's going to be set in there. And then I can collect different data sets across various different websites across the web, using that user ID as a key value to be able to link that information together to develop this holistic profile of that particular user across different places that they've been, different actions that they've taken, and then can potentially sell that profile or leverage it for use in targeting or advertising. So the goal here with this announcement, again, is to phase out third-party cookies. First-party cookies, there was not a mention of first-party cookies for purpose, again, of like your own analytics on your own website. So there's definite implications for things like attribution and being able to attribute for things like views or impressions, so brand type campaigns. But for first-party data, anything that's happening on your site, placement of IDs and things like that on your website, so you can just understand a user's behavior within your own ecosystem, those were not announced to be targeted here. So it's really important when we see all these death of the cookie and like content pieces and everything, the sky is not falling. So the goal here, and even stated within that blog post, is that third-party cookies will be phased out once these approaches have addressed the needs of users, publishers, and advertisers. And we have developed the tools to mitigate workarounds. So it's not overnight. We're not saying third-party cookies are going away. It is the goal, the intention to get rid of third-party cookies and the use of them, because they've been able to be exploited and used in so many ways, and users don't have the proper privacy and protections that they expect. And now that they're aware of what's going on, they demand something better. The goal is to figure out what that better is, and then phase out third-party cookies once that is developed, and something that is developed that addresses the needs of these various different parties that all play together on the internet. The first goal to address is conversion measurement. So what I've been talking about and mentioning around attribution and making sure that conversions are able to be properly tracked and then attributed is the first goal to when thinking about these other approaches. And then they're going to start focusing on and working on personalization. So how to personalize advertising and get the proper message in front of the proper people when this concept of third-party cookies is gone. So that's the other big update. So those are the big browser policies and restrictions that are out there that you're going to face with respect to cookies, what you can do with cookies, how you can access cookies that are placed on these various different browsers that your users might be using. So to summarize, Safari ITP, they block third-party cookies. Third-party cookies can't really use. The second implication here, first-party cookies and storage expiry is forcibly capped. First-party cookies, any that are set via JavaScript at most, are going to have an expiry of 7 days. For any user that's navigating to your site from a known cross-domain tracking domain, and there are query string parameters or tracking parameters appended to that URL, then the expiry for those cookies or anything set in that local storage is going to be 24 hours. With Firefox ETP, what it essentially does is just blocks the use or the accessibility of third-party cookies, and then also the storage ability. So again, it also blocks anything that is attempting to be stored within those different storage locations and alternative storage locations in a user's browser. So again, effectively third-party cookies blocked there. With Chrome, there are new technical requirements for the placement of cookies. So if you are leveraging third-party cookies, there are just new requirements for how exactly those are going to work and what needs to happen in order for those to be functional. And then there's also the intent to phase out third-party cookies in the next 2 years. So that's where we stand. Again, on top of these, you have the regulatory requirements requiring the transparency and requiring the consent for the use of cookies. And then you also have these technical measures in place by the browsers themselves that are limiting the use of third-party cookies, limiting just the flexibility, I guess, in the use of first-party cookies, and then also the intent to fully phase these out over the next couple of years. So those are the facts. What does this mean for you? What are the actual implications of these various different restrictions? So for just the firm implications, we'll touch on first, and then we'll get into some best practices and recommendations and just ways of thinking about this in order to be able to develop and maintain a competitive advantage. So first, impacts. When it comes to analytics, different users are going to be measured differently. Because of the expiry date that I had mentioned, even for those first-party cookies, even in your own site analytics, for any users that are leveraging the Safari browser, you're likely only going to be able to have return user information or be able to stitch together sessions for the same user, for the same anonymous user, for a 24-hour period and at most 7 days. So that might be a shift if users come to your website. Traditionally, use Google Analytics, for example. The traditional default expiry for a cookie, the standard Google Analytics cookie that tracked or set an ID for an anonymous user, was 2 years. So if a user came to your website and they come maybe quarterly or every month, that would still be the same user, and it would be a returning user for each of those. Now, with that 7-day expiry at most, obviously that's going to be a new user every single time. It's going to have a new client ID that's going to be placed. And again, also interactions with your website, even if that expiry is set to 24 hours, and there might be multiple interactions or entrances to your website through a few different sources over even a 2-week period prior to their conversion. Again, those aren't going to be stitched together. Compare that with like Chrome, where nothing's changed for the first-party cookies. So different users are measured differently. Be cognizant of that. As I've mentioned several times, there's going to be attribution limitations. So multi-touch attribution specifically, and especially with the loss of third-party cookies and the restrictions to third-party cookies within Safari and Firefox specifically, you lose visibility into things like view-through conversions. If you have an impression, say 1 day on a particular ad, they click through on a different ad and then convert on your website just through a direct visit 2 days later, that impression information, even within your advertising technology platforms, you're not going to be able to tie that together like you traditionally have been with the conversion. So there's going to be limitations and changes to how you need to think about attribution compared to how traditionally has been done. Also, there's an implication just for profiling of anonymous users. Again, for an anonymous user, you're going to lose them potentially just because of the expiry dates on those first-party cookies. So not being able to stitch together and understand that a particular user is the same across different visits. So if you're trying to develop a profile, even just propensity to buy or what it is that they like, there's going to be some limitations there. For advertising, personalization limitations, no third-party cookies means that we can't one-to-one directly target a particular individual. So traditionally, you might create a large audience pool, which has a cookie pool that are all these individuals that are likely to buy this particular thing. And so you might offer this entire audience a specific targeted advertisement for a discount on that particular product. Well, with third-party cookies no longer really being accessible or usable on Safari as well as Firefox, any users on there, that cookie pool, the user's going to have a different ID or a different cookie. You're not going to be able to directly target them in that same way. So there's limitations there for personalization of advertising. You have the attribution, the loss of the visibility prior to the site activity, remarketing and audience implications, very similar to what I was just describing for the personalization. If you have a remarketing pool, again, those IDs, it's going to be very difficult to stitch those together to be able to target and remarket to a specific individual. And then also those same site updates, for anyone that is still using those parties in that third-party context, making sure that those are updated, but that's primarily a vendor concern. Ultimately, what this means for you is a strategic shift. Your relationship with users becomes even more important. Really need to understand who are your users, what do they like, where do they go, what content do they consume, and then what type of messaging is going to be most effective. Need to really develop a relationship with the users, get them to consent, get them to give you information in other ways, because it's going to be very, very much more difficult moving forward to be able to bring in third-party data to be able to enrich our first-party data sets. The second shift here is it's critical to consider the spirit and not just the letter of these restrictions. Again, as we went through the ITP restrictions, they're evolving. As workarounds are made, they're then addressed with the laws. The intent around all of these is to give users more protections and more privacy, as well as just more choice over to who it is that they're giving information to, who it is that they're allowing to leverage information collected from them. Keep that in mind. Keep in mind the spirit, not just the letter. We're not talking about workarounds. We're wanting to really get to how do we make this a strategic advantage and change the way that we're thinking about our digital marketing practices. So finally, what are some of those best practices? What are some different recommendations that you might be able to take away from here to really enrich the digital marketing, even considering the limitations and restrictions that we're facing? Number one, get to the why of your digital practices. Again, this is going to require a strategic shift in how you look at things like analytics. Analytics becomes more important than ever. We have to have a really intimate understanding of who are our users, where do they consume content, what content do they consume, what is it from us that they're really wanting, and then how can we best get that in front of them. It's going to be a shift from being able to do this just one-to-one ID-based targeting to getting back to some of the more fundamentals of contextual types of advertising, and wanting to be able to get, again, the right message to those right people in the right place, but doing so through our understanding of the individuals as opposed to just through technical means. So it's important to really look at one, strategy there, think about it from that lens, but also look at the stack, at what you're using right now. What are the different parts of the organization, some of the different practices that you might have in place, and then the different platforms that you're leveraging? Which ones are really super reliant on cookies and doing things in this more, I guess, traditional, as in the past 2-3 years type of way of targeting based upon these different IDs and leveraging third-party cookies across the web and cookie sharing, things like that. One way of doing this, you can do a cookie audit. So this is just a screenshot from our Tag Inspector platform. Run a scan, understand all the different cookies that are being set on your website, and then also understand just what are the ones that have these proper attributes, what first-party cookies are being set, what third-party cookies are being set, and then combining that with an understanding from looking at your analytics platform. What type of browsers are your users using? What locations are they coming from? You can combine that information together to really understand, again, just that reliance on cookies, and start thinking about, how are we using currently programmatic targeting? How might that need to shift due to the new landscape? Attribution. How are we looking at attribution? What are the different mechanisms that we're using in order to do that? Maybe we need to start really focusing more on some developing our own models for attribution, or leaning on data-driven models that might be provided by some of the different platforms that we're working with, as opposed to just relying on, again, pulling together things like the impression information and being able to directly tie that to conversions. It's going to be a little bit more difficult, but at the end of the day, it makes having really sound analytics and robust analytics practices a competitive advantage. Finally, that speaks to analysis and reporting. As mentioned before, some things are going to change, understand what those changes are going to be, how they're going to affect your particular business. Another best practice, and one thing that a lot of people are starting to turn to, is a big emphasis on first-party data. The data that you have, and being able to create your own models on that data and do that analysis with your own data, as opposed to relying on third-party data sets that you're bringing in. It becomes critical in this new environment because you're unable to track users and really develop those same third-party data sets and be able to tie them in. The match rates are going to be reducing significantly as these third-party cookies start going away. I spoke on it a little bit before, but increased value of relationships with users. Anything that you can do to drive users to identify themselves on your website, such as sign-in, login functionality. At that point, if users are logged in on your website, you're able to set an ID within a cookie or within your backend system that's going to persist. You're not reliant on those unique anonymous IDs that are being set and placed in cookies on your website. So you're not beholden to the same limitations, basically, as you are if users are not identifying themselves or logging in on your website. So really thinking about login, sign in, that type of functionality where you can develop an ongoing relationship with the user and also be able to identify the user throughout the entire life cycle. Every single time that they're interacting with your website is really key. Using that to really develop that deep understanding of users. So topics like customer lifetime value, having a really good understanding of who your most valuable users and most valuable clients on your website are, so that you can then curtail everything from a targeting standpoint, from an advertising standpoint, and just a marketing decisions and strategy perspective, to those high value customers. Understanding that who, what, when, where, why, really, who are my users? Where do they get their content? What are they likely to buy? What do they respond to? Having a really good understanding of those things is going to drive decisions, again, as opposed to just being able to rely on technology to be able to do so automatically by targeting and developing these profiles of users across the web. Talked a little bit before, cookieless tracking solutions, a few different means and mechanisms for those, the fingerprinting, the things like that. A lot of these don't necessarily keep in mind the spirit of the laws, just the letter, so they're more workarounds. So the things that are being put in place in order to, well, I guess think about this more from a strategic standpoint than okay, we're not going to have cookies, but we want to do the exact same things. Think about it as a shift in what it is that you're going to be able to accomplish. With that in mind, develop all of these different new policies, new processes that you put in place with that privacy by design in mind. So keep in mind why these changes are being introduced, making sure that you're adhering to those. And then finally, stay in the know. Understand the changes. These browser updates are happening all the time, and new laws and regulations are changing all the time. So stay on top of what it is that you're required to, the requirements are as it relates to cookies and data collection. If you do these things, you will give yourself a competitive advantage in this new environment. So it looks like, I haven't looked at the time in a bit, but that we are right at time. Doesn't leave too much time for questions. Look like we have a few. What I'll do, just because we are at the end of time, I'll follow up on these just individually outside of the webinar. If you have any other questions, definitely reach out to us. They're on our website. There's a lot of additional content on the Tag Inspector website around cookies, implications, as well as privacy legal requirements around data collection, the use of cookies. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you on future webinars. Thank you all.